The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, by Andrea Wulf. Picture this. You're inching forward on your hands and knees along a ridge so narrow your boot barely fits. Loose rocks skitter away beneath you. On one side, a sheer cliff encased in ice. On the other, a stomach-churning drop of 1,000 feet down jagged black rock. The wind slices through you. Your hands and feet have gone completely numb. Your threadbare shoes are soaked and torn, leaving bloody footprints behind. Every breath is a struggle at nearly 20,000 feet above sea level. This isn't some adrenaline junkie with the latest gear. This was June 23, 1802. And the man leading this death-defying climb up Mount Chimborazo in the Andes, then thought to be Earth's highest peak, was Alexander von Humboldt. He wasn't there for bragging rights or a summit selfie. He was there for understanding. Even up there, bleeding and gasping for air, he was fumbling with his scientific instruments, a barometer, a thermometer, a sextant, measuring altitude, gravity, humidity, even how blue the sky was. Why would anyone do this? Because Humboldt saw something no one else could see. Standing on that freezing peak, gazing down at the world spreading beneath him like a living map, he didn't just see mountains and valleys. He saw connections. He saw Earth as one enormous breathing organism, a vast web where everything, from the tiniest lichen clinging to bare rock to the climate zones stretching across entire continents, was intricately woven together. Today, Alexander von Humboldt's name might draw blank stares, especially compared to titans like Newton or Darwin. Yet in his own time, he was arguably the most famous person on Earth after Napoleon. He was a Prussian aristocrat who threw away a life of comfort to plunge into the deepest South American jungles, scale the highest peaks, and chart the endless Russian steppes. He wrote tens of thousands of letters, weaving a global network of scientists, believing passionately that knowledge belonged to everyone. His ideas were nothing short of revolutionary. He invented those lines on weather maps we take for granted today, isotherms. He discovered the magnetic equator. He was the first scientist to talk about harmful human-caused climate change, watching the devastating effects of deforestation and colonial agriculture way back in 1800. He gave us the very concept of nature as we understand it, this intricate, pulsing web of life. The people you do know were profoundly shaped by him. Thomas Jefferson called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Charles Darwin himself said he never would have boarded the Beagle, never would have conceived the origin of species, without devouring Humboldt's vivid travel writings. Poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge wove his ideas into verse. America's great nature mystic, Henry David Thoreau, found his inspiration for Walden Pond in Humboldt's pages. Simón Bolívar, who liberated South America, called Humboldt the discoverer of the New World. So why has such a colossal figure faded into the shadows? Perhaps because his ideas became so fundamental, so woven into our thinking, that we forgot the man who gave them to us. His concept of nature is like oxygen, essential, everywhere, yet invisible. Andrea Wulf's captivating book, The Invention of Nature, aims to change that. It's a journey to rediscover this forgotten giant, to understand how he invented our modern view of the natural world, and why his insights matter more urgently now than ever. Stay with me, and by the end, you'll understand how one man's relentless curiosity and breathtaking adventures shaped the very way we see our planet. You'll discover the invisible threads connecting us back to Alexander von Humboldt, and you'll see nature not just as a collection of stuff, but as the living, breathing, interconnected whole he revealed it to be. Our story begins not on some windswept peak, But in the rather suffocating world of Prussian high society in the late 1700s, Alexander von Humboldt, born in 1769, the same year as Napoleon, grew up swimming in wealth but not exactly happiness. His father died when Alexander was young, and his mother, Marie Elizabeth, was emotionally distant, more invested in providing a rigorous Enlightenment education than maternal warmth. Tutors drilled young Alexander and his older brother Wilhelm in knowledge and liberty, but the household felt stiff, formal, almost airless. Wilhelm flourished in this environment, burying himself in ancient languages and philosophy. Alexander, though, he was restless. He struggled in the classroom, often thinking himself slow compared to his brilliant older brother. He escaped whenever possible, wandering the grounds of their Tegel estate, collecting plants, insects, rocks. His family nicknamed him the Little Apothecary, but didn't take it seriously. Yet even then, something was stirring. Wandering among the North American trees planted at Tegel, he began dreaming of distant, exotic lands. He devoured explorers, journals like Captain Cook's, his imagination catching fire with tales of faraway places. His mother, however, had other plans, a conventional path as a Prussian civil servant. Alexander felt trapped. He studied finance, economics, administration, hating every minute of the numbers and ledgers. He felt this deep pull toward the unknown, what Germans call Fernweh, a yearning for distant places that aches in your bones. But he didn't dare defy his mother. This internal conflict created a frantic energy. He bounced from subject to subject, trying desperately to prove his intelligence, driven by what he called a perpetual drive, as if being chased by 10,000 pigs. A compromise emerged when he enrolled at the prestigious mining academy in Freiburg. This satisfied his mother by preparing him for the Ministry of Mines, but it also let him dive into his passion for science and geology. He excelled wildly, finishing a 3-year program in just 8 months. He spent countless hours deep in mine shafts, studying rocks and working methods, pushing himself relentlessly. He invented safety lamps and breathing masks for miners, founded a mining school, and published his first scientific papers. During this time, he became obsessed with a controversial new field, animal electricity, or galvanism. Inspired by experiments showing metals could make animal muscles twitch, Humboldt ran thousands of tests on frogs, lizards, mice. Not satisfied with animals, he started experimenting on himself, making incisions in his own skin, applying chemicals, metals, electrodes, meticulously documenting every sensation, every jolt of pain. His body looked like a battlefield, but he was driven to understand the very processes of life. He was wrestling with a fundamental question: was nature just a complex machine, as thinkers like Descartes believed, or was there some kind of vital force animating living things? This intense compartmentalized scientific work was typical of the era. Natural philosophy was splintering into separate disciplines like botany, zoology, geology. Specialization brought focus but often lost sight of the bigger picture. Humboldt was meticulously measuring and classifying, a true child of the Enlightenment. But a crucial encounter was about to transform everything. In 1794, Humboldt visited his brother Wilhelm in Jena, a small university town buzzing with Germany's brightest minds, philosophers, poets, scientists. Wilhelm was part of the circle around Germany's greatest poet, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. When Alexander arrived, Goethe came to Jena, and the men met daily. They attended anatomy lectures together, dissected cadavers in a freezing medieval tower, and talked deep into the night about zoology, botany, chemistry, galvanism. Goethe, then in his mid-40s, was already a literary giant, famous for The Sorrows of Young Werther. But he was also a passionate scientist, fascinated by geology, botany, anatomy. He felt isolated in his scientific pursuits, lacking someone to truly engage with. Humboldt ignited that missing spark. In 8 days of reading books, Goethe marveled, one couldn't learn as much as what he gives you in an hour. Goethe wasn't interested in simply labeling and filing nature away. He searched for the underlying forces shaping life. He developed the idea of an form, an archetypal form, like the leaf for plants, from which all variations evolved. He believed organisms adapted to their environment while retaining a fundamental unity. He saw living things not as machines but as unified wholes where the whole shaped the parts. These ideas resonated powerfully with Humboldt. While scientists like Blumenbach applied the concept of vital forces to individual organisms, Humboldt began applying it to nature on a vastly grander scale. He started seeing the natural world itself as a unified whole, animated by interconnected forces. Comparison, not just classification or mathematics, became his key to understanding. Their discussions in Jena were transformative for Humboldt. He'd always believed in rigorous measurement and observation, but Goethe helped him appreciate the importance of subjective experience, emotion, imagination. Nature must be experienced through feeling, Humboldt wrote. He realized imagination was as necessary as rational thought to truly grasp the natural world. Goethe, in turn, was invigorated by Humboldt, entering one of his most productive phases, weaving scientific ideas into his literary work, most notably his masterpiece, Faust. The restless, knowledge-seeking protagonist, Heinrich Faust, who declared his ambition, that I may detect the inmost force, which binds the world and guides its course, echoed Humboldt's own relentless drive. Many contemporaries saw something of Humboldt in Faust, and perhaps something of Faust in Humboldt. Humboldt later said his time with Goethe equipped him with new organs through which to see the world. It was this fusion of objective science and subjective feeling, of rigorous observation and poetic imagination, that would define his unique approach. Then, in November 1796, Humboldt's mother died. At 27, he finally felt free. He inherited a substantial fortune, immediately resigned from his mining post, and began preparing for the great voyage he dreamed of forever. The destination wasn't fixed. Maybe the West Indies, Egypt, Siberia. First, he needed to prepare. He spent the next year and a half crisscrossing Europe, learning astronomy, testing instruments, studying tropical plants in hothouses, climbing mountains to compare geological formations. Finding a way out of Europe proved brutally difficult. The continent was engulfed in the French Revolutionary Wars. Plans to join expeditions to Egypt or circumnavigate the globe repeatedly collapsed due to war, lack of funds, political arrests. Finally, Humboldt traveled to Paris, the scientific heart of Europe. There, he met Aimé Bonpland, a young French botanist and surgeon who shared his passion for plants and travel. They quickly became friends and decided to travel together. After more frustrating delays trying to get a ship from Marseille to North Africa, Humboldt made a bold move. He traveled to Madrid to petition the Spanish king directly. Against all odds, in May 1799, King Carlos IV granted him an unprecedented passport, allowing this foreigner passage to Spain's vast, jealously guarded colonies in South America and the Philippines, on the condition Humboldt paid for everything himself. Within weeks, Humboldt and Bonpland were aboard the frigate Pizarro in La Coruña, Spain, their trunks crammed with 42 state-of-the-art scientific instruments. Humboldt's mood was euphoric. The real purpose of the voyage, he explained, wasn't just collecting specimens. It was discovering how all forces of nature are interlaced and interwoven. Their first stop was Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. Humboldt immediately rushed to climb the volcano Pico del Teide, reaching the summit over 12,000 feet, feeling the scorching heat from the ground, even as his face froze in the wind. The view, the magical transparency of the air, felt like an enticing promise of what lay ahead. As they sailed south across the Atlantic, Humboldt marveled at the phosphorescent sea and new constellations appearing in the southern sky. Seeing the Southern Cross for the first time, he felt he'd achieved the dreams of his earliest youth. On July 16, 1799, they finally reached the Venezuelan coast. Stepping ashore in Cumana, Humboldt was completely overwhelmed by the tropical explosion of life. Palms with crimson blossoms, birds and fish in kaleidoscopic colors, sky blue crayfish, pink flamingos. "We run around like fools," he wrote to Wilhelm, while Bonpland feared he'd go mad if the wonders don't stop soon. Humboldt found it hard to impose rational method on this wild abundance. But as he collected, he compared. Trees reminded him of Italian pines. Cacti evoked European marshes. Valleys recalled Derbyshire. Everything seemed connected. He wasn't just collecting objects. He was collecting ideas, seeking the eye's impression of the whole. The heat agreed with him. The fevers that plagued him back in chilly Europe vanished. But there was darkness here, too. Opposite their house stood the slave market. Witnessing the brutal sale of young African men and women, forced to shine their skin with oil, having their teeth inspected like livestock, cemented Humboldt's lifelong, passionate abolitionism. Nature could be breathtakingly beautiful, but human systems could be unspeakably ugly. A few months later, a violent earthquake shook Cumana. While others ran screaming into the streets, Humboldt calmly set up his instruments, timing the shocks, noting the direction. Yet inwardly, he felt profoundly disturbed. The solid ground, the very foundation of life, had betrayed its stability. We mistrust for the first time a soil on which we had so long placed our feet with confidence, he wrote. It was a jarring reminder of nature's raw power, but it didn't slow him down. After several months exploring around Cumana, Humboldt and Bonpland traveled west to Caracas, Venezuela's capital. Nestled in a high valley, Humboldt climbed mountains like Silla, sketched landscapes, and continued his relentless collecting. He was struck by moments of uncanny familiarity, a spring reminding him of a scene in Gersesvorther, the tinkle of a cowbell transporting him back to Tegel. Nature spoke a language familiar to his soul, connecting hemispheres, blending scientific observation with memory and emotion. Imagination, he realized, was like a balm of miraculous healing properties. His next goal was audacious: find the mysterious Casiquiare River, rumored to connect the two great river systems of South America, the Orinoco and the Amazon. Most geographers thought it impossible, violating the known principles of watersheds. Maps even showed a mountain range blocking where the river supposedly flowed. Humboldt was determined to see for himself. Before embarking on this perilous journey deep into the rainforest, Humboldt detoured to the Aragua Valley to see Lake Valencia. Locals told him the lake's water level was dropping dramatically. Fields now stood where water had lapped just decades before. While locals suspected a mysterious underground outlet, Humboldt investigated. He measured, examined, and concluded that clearing surrounding forests for agriculture and diverting streams for irrigation were the real causes. Planters had felled trees, removing the undergrowth that held water and protected the soil. Without the forest's cooling shade and moisture-retaining capacity, the land became barren, springs dried up, and torrential rains washed the exposed soil away, devastating the land. Here, at Lake Valencia in 1800, Humboldt developed his groundbreaking idea of human-induced climate change. He saw how deforestation triggered soil erosion, falling water levels, and altered local climate. He warned that humankind's imprudent precipitation in destroying forests could have unforeseeable impacts on future generations. This wasn't just local damage. It was about disrupting the interconnected web. He saw similar patterns elsewhere: overharvesting turtle eggs, depleting populations, pearl fishing destroying oyster stocks. Everything, he realized, is interaction and reciprocal. He was challenging the centuries-old view of humans as masters of nature, arguing instead that we needed to understand and respect nature's laws before meddling. From the relatively cultivated Aragua Valley, Humboldt turned south toward the vast, desolate plains known as the Llanos. It was brutally hot, the ground baked hard, mirages shimmered everywhere. One day, seeking relief from the scorching heat, they were chased from a murky pool by an alligator. Yet even here, Humboldt found beauty in the feeling of infinity the landscape inspired. In the town of Calabozo, he heard about electric eels. Eager to study these creatures capable of delivering powerful shocks, he witnessed a wild local capture method: driving wild horses into eel-infested ponds. The horses panicked, churning the mud, forcing the eels up while receiving violent shocks. It was a brutal spectacle: horses drowning, eels thrashing. Humboldt, however, saw a connection. The force in the eels seemed linked to lightning, magnetism, the very powers animating the universe. He and Bonpland then experimented, enduring painful shocks themselves as they dissected the eels, testing how electricity moved through different materials. Finally, they reached San Fernando de Apure on the Rio Apure, a tributary of the Orinoco. Here they got a large canoe, provisions, and hired local paddlers for the journey into the unknown. As they paddled down the Apure and then onto the mighty Orinoco, a new world unfolded. Hundreds of crocodiles basked on the shores, giant boa constrictors swam past, herds of capybaras paddled like dogs, shy tapirs foraged in the thickets, and jaguars stalked the riverbanks. River dolphins snored at night, and islands teemed with flamingos and herons. They camped on sandy banks, building fires to keep jaguars at bay. Dangers lurked constantly. Snakes curled under sleeping mats. Bonpland mistook a tame cat for a jaguar landing in his hammock. Humboldt narrowly avoided stumbling into a hiding jaguar. He almost died after accidentally touching curare, a deadly arrow poison he'd collected. Yet Humboldt was captivated. He listened to the monkeys choir at night, picking out the calls of different species. He saw the rainforest not as some peaceful Eden, but as a dynamic web pulsating with life and struggle. Jaguars hunted tapirs, which scared monkeys, which woke birds, a chain reaction, long extended and ever-amplifying battle. He saw capybaras fleeing crocodiles only to meet jaguars, flying fish, escaping dolphins, only to be snatched by albatrosses. Nature's abundance was limited only by themselves, by mutual pressure. This was a radical departure from the prevailing view of a harmonious, divinely ordered balance. Mosquitoes were a relentless torture, biting ceaselessly, flying into mouths and nostrils, making scientific work nearly impossible. Bonpland resorted to drying plants in smoky, suffocating ovens used by local tribes just to escape the insects. Their boat became a crowded, traveling menagerie, with monkeys, parrots, and other birds joining them. Food ran dangerously low. They ate fish, turtle eggs, smoked ants, and eventually life-saving Brazil nuts, which Humboldt later introduced to Europe. Collecting was deeply frustrating. The most gorgeous blossoms swayed unreachable in the canopy, and humidity ruined specimens. Yet Humboldt observed everything: plants, animals, rocks, the taste of river water, the stars, the cultures of the indigenous people he met. He admired their deep knowledge of nature, their ability to navigate the jungle, and identify trees by bark alone. Unlike most Europeans, he respected their cultures and languages, condemning the barbarism of civilized man in how colonists treated them. After weeks navigating tributaries, they finally reached the Cassiquiare in May 1800. Though missionaries confirmed it did connect the Orinoco and Amazon basins, Humboldt meticulously mapped its course, correcting previous imaginary charts. After 75 grueling days and 400 miles on the rivers, they limped into Angostura, a town that felt like a glittering metropolis. Just as they thought the worst was behind them, both men fell violently ill with fever. Bonpland nearly died. After a month recuperating, they crossed the Llanos again, now transformed by the rainy season into a lush, green landscape bursting with life. Here, Humboldt observed the Mauritia palm, noting how this single plant created a micro-ecosystem, attracting birds, holding moisture, sheltering insects. It was the tree of life, a perfect symbol of nature as a living web. He had discovered the concept of a keystone species, essential to its environment, nearly 200 years before it was formally named. Returning exhausted but thrilled to the coast, they sailed for Cuba. There, in early 1801, Humboldt read news that Captain Baudin, whose expedition he'd tried joining years earlier, was sailing around the world. Guessing Baudin might stop in Lima, Peru, Humboldt made a spontaneous, wild decision, abandon plans for Mexico, sail south to Colombia, and trek overland across the Andes to try intercepting Baudin in Lima by year's end. This meant crossing thousands of miles of treacherous mountain terrain, including climbing Chimborazo, the supposed highest peak on Earth. Before leaving Cuba, they meticulously copied notes and packed collections to send back to Europe, fearing they might not survive a global circumnavigation. They arrived in Cartagena, Colombia, in March 1801. Humboldt wrote a flattering letter to the celebrated Spanish botanist José Celestino Mutis in Bogotá, claiming the grueling overland route was chosen solely to meet him. The journey up the Rio Magdalena was another grueling 2 months of stifling humidity, mosquitoes, and crocodiles. Reaching Bogotá in July 1801, they were celebrated by the city's elite. Mutis opened his vast library and botanical collections, providing invaluable resources. After another delay due to Bonpland's recurring fever, they finally set off for the Andes in September. The crossing of the Quindio Pass was harrowing: narrow, muddy paths, thunderstorms, snow, barefoot trekking after their shoes disintegrated. They lost precious specimens when jars smashed. Yet Humboldt pressed on, measuring altitudes, observing changing vegetation zones, marveling at Andean condors, witnessing flames erupting from Pasto volcano. Feeling profoundly isolated, he wrote a long letter to Wilhelm, knowing it might never arrive, simply to feel connected. They finally reached Quito in January 1802, only to learn the news about Baudin was wrong. He wasn't sailing via South America. Any other person might have been crushed. Humboldt? He saw it as an opportunity. Now there was no rush to Lima, giving him all the time in the world to climb volcanoes. He became obsessed with understanding volcanoes. Were they isolated phenomena or connected deep within Earth? Could they unlock the planet's formation? Over the next 5 months, he systematically scaled every reachable volcano around Quito. On Pichincha, he crawled onto a narrow ledge over the crater, peering into the flickering flames, almost suffocated by sulfuric fumes. On Antisana, they endured a miserable night in a freezing hut at 13,000 feet before climbing almost to 18,000 feet, higher than any scientists before. He failed to summit Cotopaxi due to snow, but was awestruck by its perfect conical beauty. Mountains held a transcendental spell for Humboldt, a place where observation met imagination. During this time, the handsome young Carlos Montufar, son of the provincial governor, joined their team, becoming Humboldt's close companion for several years. Finally, in June 1802, they left Quito for the ultimate goal, Chimborazo. As they approached, the majestic dome dominated the horizon. The climb, as we heard at the beginning, was absolutely brutal. Nausea, dizziness, bleeding gums, injured feet, extreme cold, treacherous terrain. Yet Humboldt persisted, taking measurements, observing. Forced to stop just 1,000 feet below the summit by an impassable crevasse, he measured their altitude, 413 feet, higher than anyone had ever climbed. Looking down from that dizzying height, everything clicked. The years of observation, the comparisons between continents, the Alps, Tenerife, the Andes, it all synthesized into a single, powerful vision. He saw the moss near the snowline, resembling species from Germany, alpine plants mirroring those in Lapland. He saw vegetation zones stacked like layers, a botanical journey from the equator to the poles compressed onto one mountainside. Nature, he grasped with breathtaking clarity, was a global force, a web of life, interconnected as with 1,000 threads. This wasn't just about classifying plants. It was about understanding their relationship to climate, altitude, and location across the entire planet. It was the birth of ecology. Descending from Chimborazo, Humboldt began sketching his Naturgemälde, his painting of nature. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a visual representation of his new understanding, a microcosm on one page. It showed Chimborazo in cross-section, with plants meticulously placed according to altitude, correlated with columns of data on temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure. It illustrated, for the first time, nature as a global system, with corresponding climate zones across continents, unity in variety. The journey continued south toward Lima. Humboldt studied Inca ruins, collected indigenous vocabularies, investigated the devastating effects of quinine harvesting on cinchona forests, and continued his obsessive measurements. Near the equator in Peru, by meticulously tracking his compass needle, he discovered the magnetic equator, the line where magnetic intensity is weakest, proving it didn't coincide with the geographic equator. Reaching Lima in October 1802, they sailed north along the coast. Here, Humboldt measured the cold ocean current flowing north from Chile, the current that dramatically influences climate and supports the incredibly rich marine ecosystem. It would later be named the Humboldt Current, though he modestly protested that local fishermen had known about it for centuries. After a brief stop in Guayaquil, Ecuador, They sailed for Mexico in February 1803. Humboldt spent a year there, primarily in Mexico City, delving into colonial archives, studying Aztec manuscripts and calendars, but also exploring mines and climbing more volcanoes. He documented the brutal conditions of indigenous mine workers, harshly criticizing the exploitative colonial system. He gathered immense amounts of data on population, agriculture, trade, and the military structure of New Spain. By early 1804, after nearly 5 years, it was time to head home. His instruments were battered, and he felt scientifically isolated. They sailed to Havana, Cuba, to retrieve collections stored there. But Humboldt added one final, significant detour: a visit to the United States to meet President Thomas Jefferson. He longed to see this young republic built on liberty, a stark contrast to the colonial oppression he'd witnessed. After surviving a fierce hurricane at sea, they arrived in Philadelphia in May 1804. Humboldt wrote to Jefferson, expressing deep admiration and offering the wealth of information he'd gathered. Jefferson, a passionate naturalist and farmer himself, and deeply interested in the Spanish territories bordering the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase, eagerly invited him to Washington. For a week, Humboldt was the toast of Washington. He met with Jefferson, Secretary of State James Madison, and Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. Surrounded by maps and notebooks, Humboldt briefed them extensively on Mexico's geography, resources, population, and crucially, the disputed border region with the U.S., modern-day Texas. He shared his meticulously compiled data and maps, information Jefferson desperately needed and couldn't get from the secretive Spanish. Humboldt believed scientific knowledge should be freely exchanged, transcending national interests. Jefferson was absolutely thrilled, calling the information treasures. They discussed politics and nature. Both men believed agrarian societies fostered independence and virtue. Humboldt shared his observations on the destructive nature of colonialism, how cash crops like indigo and sugar impoverished the soil and created dependency, how mining exploited laborers, how deforestation triggered environmental ruin. Yet on the issue of slavery, they sharply diverged. Humboldt, horrified by what he'd witnessed, vehemently condemned it as the greatest evil. Jefferson, despite expressing unease, remained a slave owner, his estate built on slave labor. Humboldt argued forcefully that there were no superior or inferior races. All humans belonged to one family. All are alike, designed for freedom. For Humboldt, nature itself was a domain of liberty, its balance created by diversity, a model for political and moral truth. In June 1804, Humboldt finally left America, sailing for France. He arrived in Paris a hero, celebrated by the scientific community. Though Napoleon, now in power, was suspicious and dismissive, Paris was the undisputed center of science, and Humboldt thrived there, sharing his discoveries, collaborating with scientists like Gay-Lussac, Arago, Cuvier, and Lamarck. He began the monumental task of publishing his findings, the 34-volume voyage to the equinoctial regions of the new continent, which included the personal narrative, essay on the geography of plants with the Natur Gemälde, the lavishly illustrated Vues des Cordillères, and detailed works on zoology, botany, and astronomy. This colossal project, illustrated with 500 engravings, consumed his fortune and much of his life. Despite settling in Paris, his wanderlust persisted. He dreamed of exploring Asia, particularly the Himalayas, to complete his global comparison of mountains, but getting permission from the British East India Company proved impossible, likely due to his outspoken criticism of colonialism. Political turmoil continued. Prussia's devastating defeat by Napoleon in 1806 left Humboldt feeling buried in the ruins. During this bleak period, he wrote Views of Nature, perhaps his most beloved book, a work blending scientific observation with lyrical prose, evoking the magic of the tropics and the interconnectedness of life. It became a bestseller, inspiring generations, including Darwin and Thoreau. In 1827, after 20 years in Paris, Humboldt was finally ordered back to Berlin by Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm III. He needed the royal pension, his expedition and publications having drained his inheritance. Returning to Berlin felt like entering a provincial, stifling police state. He became a reluctant courtier, entertaining the king, his life dictated by tedious royal routines. Yet Humboldt used his position to invigorate Berlin's intellectual life. He gave wildly popular public lectures on the cosmos, drawing huge crowds from all walks of life, democratizing science. He organized a groundbreaking scientific conference in 1828, fostering collaboration and interdisciplinary exchange. His longing for exploration was finally answered when Russian Tsar Nicholas I invited him on an expedition. In 1829, at age 59, Humboldt traveled across the vast Russian Empire. Though officially focused on mining prospects, Humboldt pursued his own scientific agenda. He correctly predicted the discovery of diamonds in the Urals based on geological comparisons with Brazil. Ignoring instructions, he made a 2,000-mile detour to the Altai Mountains on the Mongolian border, seeking data to compare with the Andes. He survived an anthrax epidemic, explored the Caspian Sea, collected vast amounts of data, and continued observing human impact on the environment, noting deforestation and the drying effects of agriculture. Returning after 10,000 miles in 6 months, he urged establishing a global network of magnetic observation stations, the Magnetic Crusade, a pioneering international scientific collaboration. Back in Berlin, trapped between court duties and his insatiable scientific drive, Humboldt began his ultimate masterpiece, Cosmos. Conceived in 1834, this multi-volume work aimed to represent the entire material world, from distant stars to microscopic mosses, weaving together astronomy, geology, biology, history, art, and poetry into a unified whole. He marshaled an army of experts across the globe, sending letters, questionnaires, draft chapters, relentlessly gathering facts. His study overflowed with notes, clippings, sketches, a chaotic repository fueling a grand synthesis. The first volume, published in 1845, when Humboldt was 75, was an international sensation. It described nature as a living whole, a net-like intricate fabric, animated by interconnected forces, all without mentioning God. It electrified readers, scientists like Darwin, writers like Emerson, Poe, and Whitman, artists, politicians, and everyday people. Subsequent volumes explored the history of science and nature perception and delved into more specialized topics. Even in his 80s, Humboldt remained a central figure, advising the king, corresponding voluminously, supporting young scientists like Agassiz and explorers like Hooker, though increasingly frail and lonely after Wilhelm's death. He witnessed the failed 1848 revolutions with weary disappointment, but clung to hope for future change. He worked on Cosmos until the very end, dispatching the manuscript for the 5th volume just weeks before his death. On May 6, 1859, at age 89, as sunbeams filled his room, Alexander von Humboldt died. News spread across the globe. He received a state funeral in Berlin, mourned worldwide as the greatest man since the deluge. Just as his life ended, Charles Darwin was finalizing the manuscript for Origin of Species, a book deeply indebted to the Humboldtian worldview. Humboldt's legacy wasn't a single discovery, but a way of seeing, understanding nature as interconnected, appreciating its beauty through both science and feeling, and recognizing our profound impact upon it. Figures like George Perkins Marsh took Humboldt's warnings about environmental destruction and codified them in Man and Nature, laying the groundwork for the American conservation movement. Ernst Haeckel, inspired by Humboldt and Darwin, coined the term ecology and fused science with art, influencing the Art Nouveau movement. And John Muir, who explicitly wanted to be a Humboldt, translated this holistic vision into passionate advocacy for wilderness preservation, co-founding the Sierra Club, and fighting for national parks like Yosemite. Though his name faded in the 20th century, Humboldt's ideas remain woven into the fabric of modern environmental thought. He gave us the lens through which we still see the intricate, beautiful, and fragile web of life on Earth. What strikes you most, perhaps, after hearing Humboldt's story, is how someone so monumental could become so hidden by time. Here was a man who completely reshaped our fundamental understanding of the natural world, who connected the dots between climate, land, plants, animals, and human societies long before anyone else. He saw the planet as a single, interacting entity, a living whole. And isn't that precisely the perspective we desperately need today as we grapple with global environmental challenges? Humboldt's genius wasn't just his encyclopedic knowledge, though that was astonishing. It was his synthesis. At a time when science was fracturing into narrow specialties, he insisted on pulling it all together. He showed you couldn't understand botany without geology, or climate without ocean currents, or even human culture without its relationship to the environment. He crossed boundaries, geographical, disciplinary, cultural, seeking the underlying unity in the staggering variety of nature. Think about his Natur Gemalde. It wasn't just a list or a table. It was a picture, a visual representation of interconnectedness on a mountainside that stood for the entire globe. This fusion of precise scientific data, with an aesthetic, almost emotional appreciation of nature, was revolutionary. He believed and demonstrated that we need both reason and feeling, measurement and imagination, to truly comprehend the world. He argued that knowledge shouldn't chill the feelings, but instead fuel our sense of wonder. And his prescience about human impact is staggering. Standing by Lake Valencia 2 centuries ago, observing the consequences of deforestation, he articulated the core principles of human-induced climate change. He saw the long chain of consequences, how felling trees affected water retention, soil erosion, and local climate, and warned about the impact on future generations. He connected colonialism not just to social injustice, which he fiercely condemned, but also to environmental devastation. These weren't separate issues for Humboldt. They were intertwined aspects of an exploitative system. So what can we take away from Humboldt today, especially as young people inheriting a planet facing profound ecological challenges? First, cultivate curiosity about connections. Don't just learn about individual subjects in isolation. Ask how they relate. How does the weather pattern affect the plants in your backyard? How does the food you eat connect to land used thousands of miles away? Look for the thousand threads Humboldt saw. Start local. Spend time really observing a single place, a park, a tree, even a patch of weeds. Notice the insects, the birds, the way the light changes, how it responds to rain or drought. You'll start seeing the web everywhere. Second, embrace both data and feeling. Science gives us essential tools to understand nature's mechanisms, but our emotional connection to it fuels the passion needed for protection. Allow yourself to feel wonder, awe, even grief about the natural world. Read poetry about nature alongside scientific reports, look at landscape paintings, listen to music inspired by nature. Humboldt showed us these aren't opposing forces but complementary ways of knowing. Third, recognize our impact and responsibility. Humboldt saw clearly how human actions driven by economic desires could disrupt natural systems. Think critically about the consequences of our collective choices, from consumption patterns to energy use. Understand that social justice and environmental health are often linked, just as Humboldt observed with colonialism and slavery. Humboldt's life was an epic adventure, fueled by an insatiable desire to understand the cosmos. He showed us a world brimming with life, interconnectedness, and beauty, but also vulnerable to our actions. His work is a powerful reminder that understanding our planet requires a holistic view, one that embraces the complexity and wonder of the living web of which we are just one part. That was a glimpse into the Invention of Nature by Andrea Wulf. We've journeyed through Humboldt's incredible life and touched upon his revolutionary ideas today, but honestly, a summary barely scratches the surface. The real richness lies in the details of his adventures, the depth of his scientific inquiries, and the fascinating web of people he influenced. This summary is meant to spark your curiosity, to help you see if this story resonates with you. If you felt a connection to Humboldt's quest, his way of seeing the world, or the urgency of his environmental insights, I truly encourage you to pick up the book. Reading it isn't just about learning history or science. It's about experiencing the world through the eyes of one of its most extraordinary observers, and it might just change how you see everything around you. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if this exploration of Humboldt's world added value to your day, please consider liking this summary and subscribing to Billionaire's Bookshelf. We delve into transformative books like this regularly, aiming to uncover the wisdom that can help us all grow. Join us for the next chapter in our quest for knowledge.